Hi everyone, my name's Rob Gallagher. I'm a Senior Research Associate at the University of East Anglia, and this paper is titled Video Games, Artificial Intelligence and the Aesthetics of Sublimity. And I want in this paper to discuss two video games, Ultra's Echo and Clay's Invisible Ink. And both are games that tell stories about artificial intelligence, steeped in the canons of cyberpunk and of science fiction. These stories are fairly standard genre fare. They become more interesting, I think, however, once we consider how these games use AI to elicit emergent experiences of suspense, surprise, and what the aesthetic theorist Xian Yai calls sublimity. Capturing in so doing, I'm going to argue, the affective texture of life in an age of intelligent machines. And before I go any further, it's perhaps worth acknowledging that some people would probably object to me calling the systems I'll be discussing artificial intelligence. They're not as complex or as cutting edge as that might suggest. This, however, is the term that gaming discourse tends to favour when discussing things like the behaviour of non-player characters or NPCs and the operation of procedural generation algorithms. And of course, even more computationally advanced forms of AI and machine learning often involve a good deal of smoke and mirrors. So while these games hardly represent the cutting edge of what N. Catherine Hales calls technical cognition, I would argue that they still merit attention, not least as examples of how video games can function as sites of post-human encounter, challenging us, as Sonia Fizek has put it, to think beyond purely anthropocentric perspectives and to develop understandings of play and, for that matter, of work as an act of negotiation between human and non-human actors. So to start talking about the first of the two case studies, Echo, it was made by an 8-person team comprising veterans of the blockbusting Hitman series of games, and it sits within a generic tradition of post-human horror games. One that I've argued elsewhere poses questions about the nature and status of humans in an age of smart technologies. This generic tradition also includes games like the Forbidden Siren series and Alien Isolation, a game that was sold on the strength of the pioneering AI techniques it used to bring H.R. Geiger's hideous xenomorph creature to virtual life, and that not uncoincidentally goes by the initials AI. Pitting players against uncannily intelligent monsters, aliens, or automata, games like these repurpose Gothic tropes in order to challenge what Hales has called the misperception that humans are the only important or relevant cognizers on the planet. Unlike many video game adversaries, our enemies in these games cannot be overcome with brute force. Rather than going in all guns blazing, players must observe and strategize, reverse engineering and internalizing non-player characters' thought processes, habits, and capacities in order to survive. As a result, games like these inculcate a peculiarly intimate, if ultimately antagonistic, relationship between players and these artificially intelligent NPCs. So Echo's headline contribution to this tradition is its so-called adaptive artificial intelligence system. The game's plot sees the protagonist, N, trapped in a sentient palace, patrolled by an army of doppelgangers who learn by mimicking her behavior, integrating abilities that she uses into their own repertoires of possible actions. So the palace will periodically record actions taken by us as N, be that crouching, opening doors, running, vaulting over obstacles, or whatever it might be. And after a certain number of actions have been recorded, there's a blackout, the palace shuts down and reboots. When the lights come back up, our foes will have integrated the abilities that have been recorded into their own movesets. So this system, as you might be able to imagine, creates interesting dilemmas for the player. Firing my gun, as I'm about to do in this screenshot, might be the best way out of a tight spot right now, but it will also mean that next time the palace reboots, my doppelgangers will know how to shoot. And in a sense, Echo can be seen as recapitulating the history of video game AI. The first versions of the NPCs we encounter are crude and shambling, akin to the dopey, jerkily animated zombies found in 1990s games like Resident Evil. They quickly become more capable, however, developing in stages until they become devious, dangerous hunters. So we could see Echo as demystifying video game AI, showing how layers of quite simple scripting combine to give the impression of intelligence. If anything, this glimpse behind the curtain, however, only renders these entities eerier. Crude as their programming might be, they're still capable of outwitting their human prey and giving complacent players a nasty shock. Indeed, and as I've argued with reference to Siren and to Alien Isolation, post-human horror games are scary not because the foes that populate them are so eerily lifelike, but because they reveal how habit-prone and slow-witted supposedly intelligent human players can be. As theorists like Lydia Liu and Fred Botting have noted in their reworkings of Freud's theory of the uncanny, artificial beings have a tendency to remind us of our own machinic tendencies, and so it proves here. So if Echo's enemies show how the illusion of intelligence can emerge out of a lattice work of simple rules and protocols, the game also foregrounds questions of emergence through its environmental design. Echo's art director, Martin Emborg, has said that he took inspiration from the repetition and symmetry of ornamentations found in real-world palaces like Versailles and the Winter Palace, noting that thematically, this aesthetic fits perfectly in a game called Echo, where you play against replications. While Emborg's team ultimately rejected the idea of procedurally generating environments with algorithms, the game's layout still managed to suggest that they are not spaces designed by or for humans. Um, Instead, there's a sense here of awe-inspiring scale and complexity that's created by repeating, rescaling, and recombining a relatively small number of geometric forms and virtual objects. If all digital media, in Lev Manovich's words, comprise discrete elements assembled into larger scale objects that can themselves be combined into even larger objects, Echo draws attention to this fractal structure of new media, a canny strategy for a small development team intent on making a little go a long way. So to move to the second case study, Clay's turn-based tactical stealth game, Invisible Ink, a pun of course, covers similar thematic ground to Echo in many respects. Set in 2074, the game puts players in control of a cadre of cybernetically enhanced spies who infiltrate corporations looking for a computer powerful enough to host an advanced AI called Incognita. As you can see, this is an isometric strategy game rather than a 3D game like Echo, but there are parallels insofar as both games emphasize sneaking past unwitting adversaries rather than confronting them head on. Unlike Echo, however, Invisible Ink does use procedural generation techniques to build its levels, spinning an endless succession of environments and challenges out of the same basic building blocks, resulting in an experience that's always broadly the same, but always slightly different. Ratcheting up the stakes with each turn that we take, the game's design ensures that players are only ever one slip away from disaster. And where in most video games, disaster would mean reloading from the last checkpoint, Invisible Ink takes inspiration from the so-called roguelike genre, in which failure means starting all over again in a new set of procedurally generated maps. When players do finish the game, it transpires that the player characters were only ever pawns in a game being played by the AI Incognita. When we upload her to the mainframe, she immediately takes control of a weapon of mass destruction and mercilessly eradicates her perceived enemies. While Incognita spares the player characters, the implication is that we have unwittingly installed a new AI overlord bent on subjugating, if not eradicating, humanity. This is not a game that players are meant to stop playing once they've reached the ending, however. Rather, we're invited to jump back in for another run, perhaps on a higher difficulty level, perhaps experimenting with different characters or strategies. Thanks to the game's procedural generation routines, players can be sure to encounter an entirely new, entirely fresh set of challenges and dilemmas each time. So Echo and Invisible Ink both center on feelings of suspense and surprise. And that's true at the level of their twisty science fiction plots, but it's also true at the level of their moment-to-moment gameplay, which centers on seeing what the software will throw at us next. Beyond these feelings, these games also suggest how encounters with AI can give rise to what Shan Yai calls Sublimity, a state where astonishment alternates with boredom, excitation with prolonged desensitization, exhaustion, or fatigue, as viewers are confronted with artifacts whose complexity and scope is at once overwhelmingly impressive and wearyingly monotonous. For Eugenie Schinkel, video games are quintessentially sublime cultural artifacts. To peek into the algorithmic guts of games like these, is to glimpse in some ways the sublimity of technical cognition in its distance and difference from the human, Schinkel suggests. At the same time, there's something monotonous about these games and the spaces and situations they present us with. Not to mention something monotonous about the cycle of endless production and consumption of ever more sophisticated and obligatory technical artifacts, as Schinkel puts it, that such games participate in as high-tech commodities. And here I think it becomes possible to think about Echo and Invisible Ink as games that gesture towards the nature of contemporary game development, and by extension, the nature of creative work in an age of digitization, automation, and procedural generation. Both games are indie titles, the products of small studios working outside of the established AAA commercial publisher system. The rise of such studios has often been hailed as inspiring, as a tale of new tools and distribution platforms enabling scrappy underdogs and visionary auteurs to go toe-to-toe with corporate giants. But as scholars like Jen Whitson, Ergin Bulat, and Paolo Ruffino have shown, the reality of the indie sector is rather different. It's one of acute precarity and ruthless competition, in which developers are constantly asked to do more with less. With its thrifty use of a limited library of assets, Echo manages to approximate the production values of a AAA blockbuster quite convincingly. But this thriftiness was not enough to save Ultra Ultra, and the studio closed its doors for the last time in May 2019. Clay have fared somewhat better, and Invisible Ink provides an example of how judicious use of procedural generation algorithms can enable small teams to craft games that remain compelling for hundreds of hours. While we might see this as a happy instance of man and machine working in harmony, however, one has to imagine that the level designers responsible for feeding assets into the procedural generation algorithm must feel a bit like players of Echo, always worrying that they're inadvertently teaching new skills and tricks to their machinic systems who will one day replace them. A worry that, as Phoebe Moore and Martin Upchurch have noted, is increasingly common to workers across a whole range of industries today. In a 2010 paper, computer scientist Jim Whitehead lamented the overly sparse and artificial appearance of typical video game environments. The problem, Whitehead argued, was not the graphical capabilities of current computing hardware, which was already perfectly capable of rendering intricately decorated spaces. Rather, it was the fact that currently artists create ornament by hand, a model that, in Whitehead's words, simply doesn't scale. Today, Whitehead's solution, that of automating the process by creating algorithms that can decorate levels, is an increasingly popular one. But to my ears, there's also something faintly disturbing about the way this analysis portrays expensive and inefficient human designers as bottlenecks in the production pipeline. While it's hardly as attention-grabbing as sci-fi stories about killer machines and mainframes, I think this article is even more disquieting, perhaps, for being so understated. If Echo and Invisible Ink succeed as AI fictions, It's because they capture what it feels like living, working, and playing with AI. And this can, of course, involve shock and suspense and fear. These are games that keep players constantly braced for nasty surprises, but it can also involve monotony and banality, suggesting that the future, as we learn to get along with AI, may be both scary and also stupefyingly boring.